talk to me about it. Now, it seems like there's a little bit of a question there, and that is the footage considered part of an active investigation, or is it a matter of evidence? If it's part of an active investigation, it can remain sealed. But once it gets introduced into evidence, then it can come out. Of course, with the people that did not submit to it, to consent, I should say, will be blurred on that case. And that's why it costs so much. But it can be released by the parties, any party that was there, the police officers. They're not going to do that, though, realistically. Or Nick, Kayla, or April, after it goes from confidential information, which could have occurred already, we don't know. That is one of the questions that we had at the end of that stream. But once it is changed from confidential to private, it can then be released by any of the parties. But Nick has submitted several petitions to try and seal this footage, regardless of how much he tells you that he wants you to see it. So don't believe his lies. Don't believe. I learned that they're in the process of locating safes and opening those safes in the home. And that's the safe where the drugs were being held. But I believe the safe door was open. I'm not sure about that, though. And were there any children present? Yes. Were all the children present that are subject to this petition present? Next page. Who was not present? And this is the son. So the son was not present, according to Alicia Sweet. And how were the children? Were the children placed with a relative? Yes. How were they placed with a relative? Kayla was still in the home when I arrived, or Mrs. Rekieta. When I arrived at the home, we had discussed that the children would be going on a law enforcement hold and coming into the custody for foster care placement. She had asked if they could go with family. I stated yes, we could vet family if she supplied names. She did supply her parents' names of Dan and Sherry. It says Sherry with an I. It's a red flag. Got to watch out for those Sherrys and those candies and those Christies. Let me see. And have the children been in the care since May 23rd of 2024? Yes. Since that time, have there been any drug tests on the children? Yes. What kind of drug test? They did a hair follicle test, drug testing. And what were the results of this hair follicle testing? All the children, with the exception of, and this is the daughter, and I believe she is a 9-year-old, and in fact, I believe it was her birthday, the day that the police arrested them. Good birthday present, right? To have your door kicked in, parents taken away and gone to live on a semi-permanent vacation with the grandparents. Let me see. So all the other children tested negative, but the daughter did test positive for cocaine. And approximately what was the level of that test? Over 5,000. And what was the cutoff? 500. So 500 is like the base level of what they're looking for. If it's like 4 to 99 or whatever, they'll be like, well, could be nothing. Let's just ignore it. But over 5,000 is 10 times the base, what they're looking for in normal range. 500. Were you able to, can you explain, have Mr. and Mrs. Rekieta, have they been cooperating with drug testing for the agency? And here we go, guys. Mr. Rekieta says, objection, Your Honor. And then Mr. Pierce says, objection. And then Mr. Rekieta continues, I object to the introduction of the drug test evidence. Now, this might seem like nothing much, but this is actually a very big deal. Why can't Nick be a lawyer? Despite the fact that he said that he's not actually acting as a lawyer in his own case, he can't yell objection, as I understand it, because when I was talking to Sean about this, I believe he told me that this is called hybrid representation, which is not allowed. So you can represent yourself. You can, as a lawyer, you can represent yourself. You can have someone else represent you, but you can't do both. So Nick trying to jump in and play Phoenix Wright, objection. That's a big no-no and very embarrassing for him and his lawyer. The court says, Mrs. Weber, do you have an objection? Okay, so Mr. Pierce, never mind. So Mrs. Weber, that's right. That's next lawyer. Do you have an objection? Mrs. Weber says, I plan on cross-examining Mrs. Sweep on the drug test evidence. It has not been actually reviewed by a toxicologist. There hasn't been enough time. So there is some question as to whether or not it's accurate. But one of the questions that I think a lot of us had is it's very strange for all of the kids to test negative except for this one girl. And we do know, and like I also kind of joked about this, but like I said to like previous streams sometime back that like I'm kind of surprised that Nick didn't just shave his head so that there could be no more hair follicle testing on him, because the hair follicle test shows drugs in the system for up to 90 days. And while I have no evidence, and this is complete headcanon, so bear it with a grain of salt, it is possible that the other kids would have tested positive for these substances unless they had a haircut, right? If the boys are testing negative, but their boys typically have short hair, then in the time period of, 90 days, they may have actually tested positive for this had they not come out with a haircut. Now, again, no evidence of this. I'm not saying this is what happened, but it is something you should think about. Maybe consider the facts. Because it is very strange for just one of them to test for that. Unless Camelot's theory about the self-medication of the kids is actually, a true representation of what happened. Let me see what we have here. And have Mr. and Mrs. Rekieta cooperated with the drug testing for the agency? Now, Nick would have you know that he has done testing for everything. Has Mrs. and Mrs. Rekieta cooperated with drug testing for the agency? They did a drug test, a hair test, hair follicle drug test on May 30th. Do you have the results of that test? I do not. I did not have the results. I thought Nick said he was complying with everything that was required. Now, he's using lawyer speak there because he has been doing the piss tests from June, I think. It was it June 1st or June 7th was the first test? So I think he waited 2 weeks. And for your reference, apparently cocaine can clear a piss test in about 48 hours. So literally, if he just waits 2 days, and he can sneak away with that. He refuses to hand his hair follicle test over to County Health Services or the prosecutor, even though it's a kind of a key piece of evidence that they want to prove that he's on. And obviously, he's got a right not to incriminate himself. Of course. But it is interesting if you hear him say that I've been doing everything. I'm a good boy. I didn't do no drugs. I gave up all my tests. What are you worried about? No, he's withholding a test. The test that shows that he's a druggie. And of course, there's nothing wrong with doing drugs, in my opinion. I don't do them personally, but I drink, So it's not like, I think there's not that much difference between them. The problem is doing drugs around children and perhaps exposing them to them, which seems to be the case. That's the issue here. The degeneracy in front of children, not just the degeneracy that's, you can have a little bit as a treat if you're a single person. Let me see. Subsequent to taking the test, was there anything done by either Mr. or Mrs. Rekieta? Yes, I had received notification from the Minnesota monitoring that Mr. and Mrs. Rekieta have revoked the release of information for the Candido County to do any further testing for them for drug testing. And have you been to the home of Mr. and Mrs. Rekieta? I have. And when was that? That was on the 28th, I believe. I would have been there. It would have been the Tuesday following Memorial Day. And were you allowed into the home? I was allowed into the home. And were there any rooms that you were not allowed access to? Yes. Ooh, wait a minute. Let's see what Nick said. Nick said on June 21st. It was a requirement, and I did not prevent them from entering. In fact, I specifically asked them to inspect my entire house, which they have done. It was almost like the government worker lied. I called the government worker and their co-worker 10 times that morning to get them to my house, and they were not doing a walkthrough, and they were not prevented access. One day, I will get to tell the whole story. Looks like I'm hitting the whole story. There's actually, when he says he called the county worker 10 times, I think they mentioned that in this document as well, in regards to something else.